Hello YouTube, this is going to be a video on the killing of George Floyd, the protests that have occurred as a response to that killing, and on police racial bias in general. So for those that don't know, the police were called on George Floyd, a black man in Minneapolis, because he was accused of trying to spend a fake $20 bill. This was not the first time George Floyd had the cops called on him. He'd been arrested for theft, for trespassing, for drugs, and for entering a woman's home, pointing a gun at her, and then robbing her, essentially. When the police attempted to arrest George Floyd for trying to spend that fake $20 bill, or allegedly trying to spend that fake $20 bill, George Floyd resisted arrest. He didn't attack the cops or anything like that, but he tried to resist being put into the police car. They got him on the ground. A bunch of people videotaped it as they pinned him down. Very famously, one of the cops had his knee on George Floyd's neck. It was there for a long time. He goes unconscious at the end of the video and ultimately died. So if you look at the autopsy reports, he died of heart failure brought on by a pre-existing heart condition, hypertension. The fact that he had fentanyl and meth in his system probably didn't help. He tested positive for COVID-19, although I'm not sure if he was still symptomatic and if that played any role. But the report also does make clear that the police restraint was a factor in the death, and so the police should be held responsible for that, and they are being held responsible for that. The police involved are being tried for manslaughter. And as usual, everyone is claiming that there is a racial motive behind this, and as usual, when people claim that there is a racial motive behind something that a white person did to a black person, there is literally no evidence that there's any racial motive involved in this at all. Of course, assuming that someone did something for an immoral reason, an especially immoral reason is, racism is considered an especially immoral motive, to assume that someone did something for an immoral reason simply because of their race, which seemingly is what people are doing here, is itself a racist thing to do against white people. And it is an especially problematic thing to do, since if you look at experiments and meta-analyses of experiments, which test to see if people treat others differently according to their race, among white people there is no racial bias detected. So rationally speaking, the assumption should always be for any random set of white people that they are not going to exhibit racial bias until we have positive evidence to indicate otherwise. Some people would say that this kind of thing, where a white police officer kills a black person, happens so frequently that we have to assume that something weird is going on. Such people have been brainwashed by the media. The fact of the matter is that there are lots of things that kill black people far more often than police. This includes diseases like diabetes, it includes drugs, it includes car accidents, it includes STDs like HIV, it includes being killed by another black person. It also includes things like accidentally falling down or accidentally drowning. Now, accidentally drowning kills almost no one. It kills 590 black people per year in this country. You never hear about it in a news story. It's a total non-issue because we live in a country with tens of millions of black people, and so this kind of thing really just doesn't matter. And yet, that happens far more often than does being killed by police to black people. And so, in a society that was not trying to get people to concentrate on white people killing black people for political reasons, you probably would have just never even heard of it happening, because it happens so rarely. Now, let's be specific about what that political reason is. The reason is so they can blame white people for something, because the media is possessed by an ideology which is anti-white in nature. This is why they don't care about the fact that black people are far more likely to be killed by other black people than they are to be killed by cops, because the news fundamentally is not pro-black, it is anti-white, and those things are not the same thing. When any of these things are talked about, the emphasis is always on trying to blame white people for whatever the subject is. And that is the fundamental political motive behind the media concentrating so much on these instances to such a degree that they've actually convinced people that something that almost never happens in this country is commonplace. This is why you're also not going to hear the news concentrate on the fact that black people kill about 1,000 white people per year in this country. Now, some people will say that there has to be a racial motive behind these killings because black people make up about 13% of the population, but about 26%, 27% of those killed by police. What this assumes is that if police were not racist, they would only kill black people about 13% of the time. But that would only be true if police were running around shooting people randomly from the general population. But they're not. Generally speaking, they're shooting people who are under arrest for something else, right, like George Floyd was. And black people make up about 27% of those who are arrested, versus only 24, 25, 26%, depending on the source you use, of people killed by police, which makes that look at about perfect parity of what you would expect if police were totally unracially biased, were shooting people randomly with respect to race among the people who have the police called on them. right, or who are being arrested by police because the police saw them doing something. You can also note that black people make up 37% of those who commit violent crimes, 38% of those who kill cops, and 53% of those arrested for murder. I think that percentage of people who kill police is especially relevant. That gives us an idea of the black representation among people who are involved in potentially fatal interactions with police. That, I think, is the best benchmark, and that suggests that, if anything, black people are underrepresented among those killed by police. There's no justification for using the general population numbers as the benchmark for this comparison. And any other number you can use, all of which are more plausible than the U.S. population number, suggests that there's no bias or there is a pro-black bias. And if you don't want to trust me, I'll just note in passing, this exact same point has been made in peer-reviewed academic literature. If you use a reasonable benchmark, there's no evidence of bias. Moreover, black police officers are at least as likely, if not more likely, than white police officers to kill a black person, making racial animus an even more implausible explanation for black representation among those killed by cops. Now, the benchmarks that I've proposed using, things having to do with arrest rates for violent crimes and especially killing a police officer, these things assume that the rates of arrest for violent crime are not themselves already racially biased, so it's very quickly just established that that is true, because it is. If you look at the propensity of police officers to arrest, to pull over black suspects, as well as to shoot them, as well as, for that matter, I'll just throw it in there since we're talking about it, the propensity of judges to find people guilty or to give them long sentences. None of this differs in such a way that suggests that white police officers or white judges are more harsh on black civilians than are black police officers and black judges, again suggesting that racial animus plays a role in literally none of this. Moreover, the rate at which black people are arrested for crimes corresponds very well with the rate at which black suspects are reported to the police by civilians. And if you look at the National Victimization Survey, where the federal government comes in and they take a large random sample of the U.S. population, asks them if they've been a victim of a crime within the last year, and if so, to describe the perpetrator, including the race of the perpetrator, we find that, once again, these numbers match up pretty well with the arrest rates. If anything, they suggest that black people are underrepresented among those arrested for crime. Just like relative to a sensible benchmark, they are underrepresented among those who are killed by police. And I just want to reiterate that I am in no way trying to suggest that George Floyd was killed because he was committing a violent crime. The point is that George Floyd's killing does not fit into a pattern that should raise our suspicion such that we should suspect that George Floyd was killed due to racial reasons. So these violent riots are based on a total mythology. Some people have been talking about these violent riots, speaking of them, in very delusional ways. I've seen black people say, look, we've been asking peacefully for decades, it hasn't worked, nothing has changed, and so now we gotta do riots that involve some degree of violence. Given that black race riots have led to the deaths of hundreds of people and thousands of people being seriously injured since the 60s, obviously, this is a completely crazy thing to say. Anyone who is saying this probably just fundamentally does not care about the truth. I think everyone knows that black people have been doing these riots for a long time. But nonetheless, I've seen this said many times. It's just a baseless excuse for violent behavior. And I think it's worth emphasizing that the violence of these protests has not been typical. Over 20 people have been killed in these riots. That is more than any riot since the LA riots. It is in the top 5 of the worst black race riots ever. And it is, most importantly, totally contrary to the trend of the last few decades, which has been de-escalating levels of violence at these protests. This either is a random event that goes contrary to that trend, but that trend will continue, or it could be the beginning of a reversal of that trend as we see things move back towards how they were in the 1960s. But of course, this protest that's happening now actually differs in a lot of important ways from the sorts of protests that happened 50 years ago. For one thing, most of the protesters in many cities are white. In many cities, the police are joining the protests. They have mass corporate support. There was a list published, I think today or yesterday, of 270 major corporations that have issued statements of support for these riots. There is a consensus on the wrongdoing of the officers. The right and the left agree the officer was in the wrong, and there are no specific serious demands aimed at preventing this from happening in the future being made by the protesters. And so what we see is that the power structure of society is overwhelmingly supporting these riots. A huge number of people in the populace, they're supporting these riots, and there's no way these riots can solve anything or change anything. And both of those things, but especially when they're combined, seem to me to suggest that we're now living in a context in which these kinds of very dangerous riots are more likely now to happen. Many of these unusual characteristics of the riots, I think, in turn can be explained by a phenomenon or event that is sometimes referred to as the Great Awakening. This refers to the fact, as seen in this chart, that the left has become obsessed with talking about racism and white privilege and this sort of thing in the last decade or so. Here we see this is the case for the New York Times, but importantly, this is also the case for the general American public. In 2009, most white Americans did not think that racism was a major problem in society. Today, most of them do. And in 2009, most white people did not think that we needed to give more rights to black people, whereas today most white people do. And so we see that both in terms of the sort of liberal elites, but also in terms of the general public, there's been a strong increase in left-wing views on race. Given that left-wing views on race have become so prevalent in society, it's worth taking a second to understand their true nature, which is an anti-white nature. We know this via a variety of experiments that have been carried out, showing that, for instance, liberals are more willing to sacrifice someone for the greater good if that person is a white-sounding name rather than a black-sounding one. Or that liberals think that it is more plausible that black people are genetically superior to white people with respect to traits like intelligence than the reverse of that. Or that liberals are more willing to censor information if it sheds a bad light on black people rather than white people. That liberals are more concerned with things like disparate impact and, for instance, people having to pay more for home insurance because they live in a risky area when the people having to pay more are black rather than white. And we know that if we just ask people directly about how they feel about various racial groups, what we find is that most groups have a moderate level of in-group bias, but white liberals have a group of out-group bias, which is about as strong actually as the in-group bias of typical groups. And so the combination of all this evidence, I think, really does go to show that left-wing ideology is very fundamentally connected to a bias against white people. Of course, we also know that many important institutions, especially if we're talking about institutions that people trust when forming their political viewpoints, such as the media and academia, are overwhelmingly controlled by liberals. And if liberalism is an anti-white ideology and those institutions are controlled by liberals, then obviously those institutions are themselves controlled by anti-white ideologies, or ideologues of such ideologies at least. And so our institutions are being captured by people who believe in an anti-white ideology and who in the last 10 years have become kind of obsessed with emphasizing the anti-white aspect of their ideology and maybe even have become more anti-white in their ideology. And unfortunately, this country has a lot of people in it who will trust institutions like academia and the media to deliver them information in an unbiased and non-racist way simply because the people who occupy such institutions and profess leftist ideology claim to be anti-racist, and they just trust that evidently. And so the media and academia get away with socializing people into an ideology which is based on mythology, total lies, has nothing to do with reality whatsoever. But it tells people lies that upset them very much, and now they are literally burning down the country and killing people. This is obviously stupid, it is obviously immoral and evil, and frankly, because this ideology is winning, there's, seems to me, good reason to be kind of pessimistic about things going forward, at least in the short run, maybe even in the long run. But hopefully I'm wrong and this insanity will stop and reverse. I guess, only time will tell.